The security checkpoint at McCarran International Airport buzzed with the usual chaos of departure gates and rolling luggage. But something was different about the woman approaching Terminal C, Captain Marlena. Ghost. Vasquez moved with the controlled precision of someone who had learned to carry invisible weight. Her weathered leather duffel bag slung across her shoulder like a shield against curious stares. She wore civilian clothes now, faded jeans, and a simple gray hoodie. But 20 years of military bearing couldn't be erased by cotton and denim. The TSA agent, a heavyset man with tired eyes and a nameplate reading DAVIDSON, barely glanced up as Marlena approached. She placed her bag on the conveyor belt with the same careful deliberation she once used to prep ordnance on an F-16. Behind her, a businessman tapped his foot impatiently while checking his Rolex, muttering about delays. A family with 3 screaming children struggled with car seats and diaper bags, their frustration mounting as the line crawled forward. "Ma'am, step through," Davidson called, his tone carrying the boredom of someone who had processed 10,000 passengers this month alone. Marlena walked through the metal detector without incident, but something made Davidson pause as he watched the X-ray monitor. Her bag sat frozen on the screen, its contents creating shadows that didn't quite make sense. He frowned, leaning closer to the ghostly outlines on his screen. "Bag check," he announced, his voice cutting through the terminal noise. Heads turned. The businessman sighed audibly. The mother with the screaming toddler rolled her eyes. Marlena simply nodded and moved to the inspection area, her face betraying nothing. Davidson pulled the worn leather bag from the conveyor and set it on the stainless steel table with unnecessary force. "Gonna need you to open this up," he said, already reaching for the zipper before she could respond. His fingers worked quickly, professionally invasive in the way that airport security had become since 9/11. The watching crowd gathered closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of someone else's inconvenience. What happened next would be replayed on security cameras, dissected in internal reviews, and whispered about in break rooms for months. Davidson's hand stopped moving. The businessman's irritated muttering died mid-sentence. The screaming children seemed to sense the shift in atmospheric pressure and fell silent. Even the constant hum of the airport seemed to pause, as if the building itself was holding its breath. There, nestled between folded civilian clothes and a worn paperback novel, lay a perfectly pressed Air Force dress blue uniform. The fabric held creases so sharp they could cut glass, maintained with the obsessive care that only comes from understanding what it means to wear the cloth of your country. Silver wings gleamed against the dark blue breast pocket, catching the harsh fluorescent lights like captured starlight. The silence stretched. Davidson's hands hovered over the uniform as if touching it might burn him. Behind Marlena, the small crowd of inconvenienced travelers found themselves staring at something they didn't quite understand but instinctively respected. The businessman's Rolex suddenly seemed less important. The mother gathered her children closer, not from fear, but from reverence. Marlena stood perfectly still, watching Davidson's face transform as realization dawned. Her weathered hands remained at her sides, patient as stone, while her pale green eyes held depths that spoke of cockpits at 30,000 feet and decisions made in split seconds where failure meant death. She had learned long ago that some moments required absolute stillness, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply exist in the space you occupied. The uniform wasn't just cloth and thread. It was a story written in service ribbons and campaign medals, in the worn spots where wings had been pinned and removed countless times, in the invisible weight of missions flown and battles won. It was proof of a life spent in service to something larger than self, folded with military precision and carried with quiet pride. Davidson finally looked up, meeting Marlena's eyes for the first time. What he saw there made him take an involuntary step back. 24 hours earlier, Marlena had been standing in a different kind of line, facing a different kind of scrutiny. The retirement ceremony at Nellie's Air Force Base had been smaller than she'd expected. A handful of fellow pilots, some bass brass and her sister Carmen, who had driven up from Phoenix with her twin daughters. The girls, both 16 now, had fidgeted in their Sunday dresses, while an Air Force chaplain spoke words about service and sacrifice that seemed to float away on the desert wind. Captain Vasquez, Colonel Martinez had said, presenting her with the folded flag and the shadow box containing her medals. 20 years of distinguished service. The Air Force won't be the same without Ghost in the cockpit. The small crowd had applauded politely, but Marlena could see it in their faces, relief that the old guard was finally stepping aside, making room for fresh blood and new ideas. She had earned the call sign Ghost during her third deployment to Afghanistan, not for her ability to appear and disappear, but for her unnerving talent for surviving missions that should have been fatal. While other pilots returned from combat sorties with stories of near misses and mechanical failures, Ghost came back clean, her F-16 unmarked, her mission reports models of efficiency. Some said she was lucky. Others whispered that she was touched by something beyond luck, a supernatural ability to slip between the bullets and bombs that claimed other aircraft. The truth was simpler and more complex. Marlena had learned to read the sky the way other people read books, understanding the subtle language of wind patterns and thermal currents that could hide an aircraft from enemy radar or position it for the perfect attack run. She flew not with aggression but with patience, waiting for the moment when all variables aligned before striking with surgical precision. In a fighter-pilot culture that celebrated aggression and bravado, her methodical approach had earned her respect grudgingly and advancement slowly. Now, standing in civilian clothes at an airport security checkpoint, she watched that same dismissive attitude play out in real time. Davidson and the watching crowd saw what they expected to see, a middle-aged woman traveling alone, possibly divorced, probably harmless. They had no context for the leather flight jacket hanging in her closet at home, or the commendation letters filed away in a shoebox, or the dreams that still woke her at 300 with the phantom sensation of pulling G's in a combat turn. The uniform in her bag wasn't just clothing. It was armor against invisibility, proof that she had existed in a world where her presence mattered, where her decisions had consequences measured in lives saved and missions accomplished. Carrying it was both burden and blessing, a reminder of who she had been and who she was trying to become. Davidson's hands trembled slightly as he reached toward the uniform, then stopped. "Ma'am," he said quietly, and something in his tone made the businessman step forward, suddenly interested. The crowd dynamics at an airport security checkpoint follow predictable patterns. Inconvenience breeds irritation, which breeds impatience, which breeds the kind of mob mentality that turns ordinary people into entitled monsters demanding immediate satisfaction. But sometimes, rarely, something cuts through that pattern like a blade through silk, creating a moment of shared humanity that reminds everyone present that they are witnessing something significant. This was one of those moments. The businessman, who had been checking his phone every 30 seconds, slipped it into his pocket. The mother with the 3 children stopped trying to juggle diaper bags and car seats and simply stood still, her youngest daughter pressed against her hip with unusual quiet. Even the TSA agents at neighboring checkpoints paused in their routine pat-downs and bag searches, drawn by the subtle shift in atmosphere. Marlena watched it all with the tactical awareness that had kept her alive through 4 combat deployments. She cataloged exits and sight lines, identified potential threats and allies, processed body language and vocal tones with the automatic efficiency of someone trained to make life-or-death decisions in milliseconds. But beneath the professional assessment, she felt something else, a flutter of vulnerability that she hadn't experienced since her first solo flight as a lieutenant. "Were you Air Force?" Davidson asked, and the question hung in the air like contrails at altitude. "AM," Marlena corrected gently. "Once Air Force, always Air Force." The distinction mattered more than grammar. Military service wasn't just a job you left behind when you changed careers. It was a fundamental alteration of identity that persisted long after you turned in your ID card and cleaned out your locker. The values didn't retire. The bonds with fellow service members didn't expire. The willingness to sacrifice for something larger than yourself didn't diminish just because you started collecting a pension instead of a paycheck. Davidson nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his tired eyes. "My son," he said quietly, Marines, deployed to Helmand last year. He didn't elaborate, but he didn't need to. The statistics were well known. The casualty reports a constant background hum in military families. Hope and fear existed in equal measure, separated by the thin line of luck and training. "He's in good hands," Marlena said, and meant it. The American military might have its flaws and bureaucratic frustrations, but the quality of training and leadership at the small unit level remained extraordinary. Marines especially were taught to look after their own, to never leave a fellow warrior behind, to uphold standards that demanded excellence even in the worst circumstances. Behind her, the businessman cleared his throat, not with impatience now, but with something resembling respect. "Excuse me," he said, stepping forward. "I just wanted to say thank you for your service." The words were simple, possibly cliched, but delivered with genuine sincerity that transformed them into something more meaningful. Marlena acknowledged the thanks with a slight nod, uncomfortable as always with public gratitude. Military culture discouraged drawing attention to individual achievements, emphasizing instead the collective effort required for mission success. She had never served for recognition or praise, but for the simple satisfaction of doing difficult work well, of being part of something that mattered. The moment stretched, balanced on the edge of something larger. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the airport security checkpoint, surrounded by the mundane chaos of commercial travel, a small group of strangers found themselves connected by threads of respect and recognition that transcended the usual boundaries of civilian interaction. They were witnessing not just the inspection of a bag, but the revelation of a life lived in service to ideals that most people only encountered in abstract form. Davidson carefully lifted the uniform from the bag, his movements now deliberate and respectful. The fabric seemed to glow under the artificial lights, each ribbon and medal a story unto itself. The silver star caught the light first, awarded for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States, the citation reading simply, "For conspicuous bravery during aerial combat operations over Afghanistan." Below it, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with multiple oak leaf clusters, the Combat Action Medal, and ribbons representing deployments to some of the most dangerous airspace in the world. The watching crowd had grown larger now, drawn not by the spectacle of inconvenience but by the gravity of genuine respect. A young Marine in civilian clothes, probably on leave, stood at attention despite himself. An elderly man who might have been a Vietnam veteran removed his baseball cap. Even the children seemed to sense the solemnity of the moment, their usual airplane terminal energy subdued by forces they didn't understand but instinctively honored. "Ma'am," Davidson said, his voice carrying new weight, "I'm going to need to complete the inspection, but I want you to know." He paused, struggling with words that suddenly felt inadequate. "Thank you doesn't seem like enough." Marlena's pale green eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "Just doing the job," she said, but the words carried depths of meaning that extended far beyond their surface simplicity. In military culture, doing the job encompassed everything from routine maintenance checks to split-second life-or-death decisions, from the grinding monotony of deployment schedules to the split-second precision required in aerial combat. The inspection continued, but the tone had changed completely. Davidson handled each item with careful respect, the worn paperback copy of The Right Stuff that had accompanied her through multiple deployments, the small leather notebook filled with her careful handwriting documenting flight hours and mission details, the silver bracelet engraved with the names of fellow pilots who hadn't made it home. Each object told part of a larger story, pieces of a life dedicated to service and sacrifice, in ways that most civilians could never fully comprehend. As Davidson carefully refolded the uniform and placed it back in the bag, something extraordinary happened. The businessman stepped forward and extended his hand. "Captain," he said simply, using her rank with natural respect. "It was an honor to meet you." Others followed, the mother with her children, the young Marine, the elderly veteran, each offering their thanks or sharing brief stories of their own connections to military service. Marlena accepted each gesture with quiet grace, understanding that these moments of connection were part of the complex relationship between military and civilian communities. Most Americans supported the troops in abstract terms, but rarely had opportunities for direct interaction with the men and women who served. When those opportunities arose, they often carried emotional weight that surprised both sides. The inspection complete, Davidson handed her the bag with ceremonial care. "Safe travels, Captain," he said, and the words carried the weight of genuine respect rather than routine courtesy. As Marlena shouldered her bag and moved toward her gate, she left behind a small group of people who had been changed by the encounter. They would go home with stories to tell, with a slightly different understanding of what service meant, with faces and names to attach to the abstract concept of military sacrifice. The businessman would think twice before complaining about airport security. The mother would point out military personnel to her children and explain why their service mattered. The young Marine would carry himself a little straighter, reminded that his chosen profession commanded genuine respect from civilians who understood its importance. But perhaps most importantly, Davidson would handle the next military member who came through his checkpoint, with the kind of respect that transformed routine security procedures into moments of recognition and gratitude. The ripple effects of individual encounters could spread far beyond their immediate circumstances, creating networks of understanding and appreciation that strengthened the bonds between those who served and those they protected. For Marlena, the encounter served as a bridge between her military past and civilian future. She had spent weeks preparing for retirement, attending transition workshops and updating her resume, trying to translate 20 years of military experience into language that civilian employers could understand. Fighter pilot skills didn't always transfer obviously to corporate environments, and she had worried about her ability to find meaningful work that could match the sense of purpose and importance that had defined her Air Force career. But the respect and gratitude she had witnessed at the security checkpoint reminded her that military service created value that extended far beyond specific technical skills. The leadership experience, the ability to perform under pressure, the commitment to excellence, the understanding of teamwork and mission accomplishment. These qualities were highly valued in civilian organizations that understood their importance. More significantly, the encounter reminded her that transitioning from military to civilian life didn't require abandoning her military identity, but rather finding new ways to honor and apply the values that had guided her service. As she settled into her seat for the flight to Denver, where she would begin a new chapter as a commercial airline pilot, Marlena reflected on the unexpected gift that the security checkpoint encounter had provided. She had been prepared for indifference, possibly even hostility, as she navigated the unfamiliar territory of civilian life. Instead, she had found recognition, respect, and gratitude that validated her years of service and provided confidence for the challenges ahead. The airplane pushed back from the gate as the sun set over Las Vegas, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of sunrises over the Hindu Kush during her deployment to Afghanistan. From her window seat, she watched the lights of the city spread out below like a circuit board, each point of light representing lives lived and dreams pursued in the complex tapestry of American civilian life that she had spent 20 years protecting from 30,000 feet above. The transformation from military to civilian life was often described as a difficult transition, and Marlena knew that challenges lay ahead. She would need to learn new procedures, adapt to different organizational cultures, and find ways to apply her combat experience to the relatively peaceful world of commercial aviation. But she also understood that the core skills that had made her an effective fighter pilot, situational awareness, decision-making under pressure, attention to detail, and absolute commitment to safety, would serve her well in any cockpit. More importantly, the encounter at the security checkpoint had reminded her that service didn't end with retirement. The values she had learned in the Air Force, integrity first, service before self, excellence in all endeavors, could be applied in civilian contexts to continue making positive differences in the lives of others. Whether she was safely transporting passengers across the country or mentoring young pilots just beginning their careers, she could continue to serve in ways that honored her military experience while embracing new opportunities for growth and contribution. The flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, beginning the standard safety demonstration that Marlena had heard thousands of times during her military career. But as she listened to the familiar instructions about oxygen masks and emergency exits, she found herself thinking not about safety procedures, but about the invisible threads that connected all the passengers on the aircraft: business travelers heading to important meetings, families visiting relatives, students returning to college, each person trusting their lives to the skill and judgment of pilots they would never meet. In the military, that trust was explicit and acknowledged. Fighter pilots understood that their decisions affected not just their own safety, but the success of missions and the lives of fellow service members who depended on their support. The weight of that responsibility was both burden and honor, creating bonds of mutual dependence that forged some of the strongest relationships in human experience. Commercial aviation operated on similar principles of trust and responsibility, but the connections were less obvious and more abstract. Passengers rarely thought about the pilots in the cockpit except during moments of turbulence or unusual circumstances. The crew members were professionals doing their jobs, competent but invisible, responsible for hundreds of lives but rarely acknowledged except in crisis situations. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude and the cabin lights dimmed for the evening flight, Marlena settled back in her seat and closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to process the day's events. The retirement ceremony seemed like it had happened weeks ago rather than hours. The encounter at the security checkpoint had transformed what she expected to be a routine travel experience into something approaching a ceremony of recognition and transition. She thought about the young Marine who had stood at attention, despite being in civilian clothes, recognizing in that instinctive gesture the shared values and experiences that created bonds between service members regardless of branch or generation. She thought about Davidson's hands trembling as he handled her uniform, understanding for the first time that the abstract concept of military service was embodied in real people making real sacrifices for causes larger than themselves. Most of all, she thought about the path ahead. Denver represented not just a new job but a new life, an opportunity to discover who Captain Marlena, Ghost, Vasquez might become when she was no longer defined primarily by her military rank and occupation. The transition would require courage of a different kind than she had needed in combat, not the physical bravery required to fly through enemy fire, but the emotional resilience needed to reinvent herself while staying true to the values and experiences that had shaped her identity. The businessman from the security checkpoint was seated several rows ahead, and she could see him typing on his laptop, probably working on presentations or reports that seemed desperately important in the moment but might be forgotten within weeks. The mother with her children was reading quietly while her youngest slept across two seats, exhausted by the day's travels and excitement. Each passenger was absorbed in their own concerns and destinations, connected to the others only by their shared presence on the aircraft and their common trust in the crew's competence. But beneath those surface connections, Marlena recognized deeper patterns of interdependence that reflected the complex relationships within American society. The businessman's work might create jobs for the mother and others like her. The children would grow up to become taxpayers who supported the military that had defined Marlena's career. The airline pilots and crew members were part of a transportation network that enabled commerce, family connections, and cultural exchange on a scale that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Understanding those connections had always been part of military service, protecting not just abstract concepts like freedom and democracy, but the specific relationships and opportunities that allowed ordinary people to live ordinary lives without constant fear of violence or disruption. Fighter pilots might engage enemy aircraft in dramatic aerial combat, but the ultimate purpose was to maintain the peaceful conditions that allowed families to vacation together and business travelers to pursue their goals without thinking about military conflicts or security threats. As the flight continued through the night sky, Marlena found herself thinking about legacy, not just her own, but the collective legacy of her generation of military service members. They had served during a period of extended conflict, when the United States was engaged in multiple military operations around the world, when the demands on military personnel were higher than they had been since World War II. The human costs had been significant: casualty rates, family separations, multiple deployments that strained marriages and disrupted normal career progression. But they had also served during a period of remarkable technological advancement, when American military capabilities reached levels of precision and effectiveness that previous generations could barely have imagined. Smart weapons that could strike targets with minimal collateral damage, communication systems that enabled real-time coordination across vast distances, aircraft that could operate in conditions that would have been impossible just decades earlier. Marlena's own career had spanned that technological revolution. She had begun flying aircraft that were essentially updated versions of designs from the 1970s, and had finished flying systems that incorporated artificial intelligence, advanced sensors, and networking capabilities that transformed individual aircraft into nodes in a larger information system. The learning curve had been steep and continuous, requiring constant adaptation to new technologies and procedures. More importantly, her generation had served during a period when the traditional boundaries between military and civilian roles had become increasingly blurred. Modern conflicts required not just traditional combat operations, but nation-building, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and complex peacekeeping missions that demanded skills and knowledge that went far beyond conventional military training. Success required understanding not just tactics and technology, but culture, economics, politics, and human psychology. Those expanded requirements had created opportunities for military personnel to develop skills and experiences that translated well to civilian careers. But they had also created stresses and challenges that were difficult for previous generations of veterans to understand. The simple narrative of military service, join up, serve your country, come home to parades and gratitude, had been complicated by decades of involvement in conflicts that lacked clear objectives, definitive victories, or obvious endpoints. For Marlena and others like her, retirement from military service was both relief and loss. Relief from the constant pressure of deployment schedules, training requirements, and institutional demands that left little time for personal relationships or individual pursuits. But also loss of the clear sense of purpose and importance that came from being part of an organization with a mission that genuinely mattered, where individual contributions had direct impact on outcomes that affected national security and international stability. The challenge was finding ways to transfer that sense of purpose and importance to civilian careers that might seem mundane by comparison. Commercial airline pilots performed essential work that enabled the economic and social connections that held modern society together. But the day-to-day reality involved routine procedures and standard protocols that lacked the intensity and immediate importance of military operations. Yet as Marlena looked out the window at the lights below, scattered across the landscape like stars, she began to understand that the transition from military to civilian service didn't require abandoning her commitment to something larger than herself. It required expanding her definition of service to include the quiet professionalism that enabled ordinary people to trust their lives to strangers, the dedication to safety and excellence that made routine operations possible, and the commitment to competence that allowed complex systems to function smoothly despite their inherent risks and challenges. The aircraft began its descent into Denver as the eastern horizon started to show the first hints of dawn. Below them, the city spread out in neat geometric patterns, streets and highways creating a grid that organized human activity across hundreds of square miles. The airport appeared in the distance, its runways outlined in lights that provided guidance for pilots navigating the transition from sky to ground. As they descended, Marlena thought about all the other aircraft in the sky at that moment. Hundreds of flights carrying thousands of passengers across the country and around the world, each one guided by pilots who had accepted responsibility for the lives entrusted to their care. It was a vast network of trust and competence, enabled by decades of technological advancement, and maintained by professionals who understood that their individual performance contributed to a larger system that connected people, communities, and nations in ways that created prosperity, opportunity, and security for millions. Her military service had been part of protecting that system from external threats, enemy aircraft, terrorist attacks, and hostile nations that sought to disrupt the peaceful conditions that made commercial aviation possible. Her civilian career would be part of operating that system, ensuring that the connections and opportunities it provided remained reliable and safe for the people who depended on them. The landing was smooth and professional, a routine operation performed with the kind of competence that made extraordinary outcomes seem ordinary. As the aircraft taxied to the gate and passengers began gathering their belongings, Marlena realized that she was witnessing a perfect example of the civilian equivalent of military professionalism, trained personnel performing complex tasks with precision and reliability, accepting responsibility for outcomes that affected the lives of others, maintaining standards of excellence that enabled trust and confidence even among strangers. As she deplaned and walked through the Denver airport toward the baggage claim, Marlena carried with her not just her leather duffel bag with its carefully folded uniform, but also a new understanding of how her military experience could be applied to civilian challenges. The values were the same: integrity, service, and excellence. The context was different, but the fundamental commitment to something larger than individual interest remained unchanged. The encounter at the Las Vegas security checkpoint had been a gift, a reminder that military service created bonds of respect and gratitude that persisted long after active duty ended. But more importantly, it had shown her that the transition to civilian life didn't require abandoning her military identity, but rather finding new ways to honor and apply the lessons learned through 20 years of service to country and fellow service members. As she collected her luggage and headed toward the exit, where a new chapter of her life was waiting to begin, Captain Marlena Ghost Vasquez carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that true service never really ended. It just found new forms of expression that continued to make the world a better, safer, and more connected place for everyone who shared the common privilege of American citizenship and the common responsibility of contributing to something larger than themselves. The morning sun was rising over the Rocky Mountains as she stepped outside the terminal, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded her of sunrise flights over Nevada, Afghanistan, and all the other places where she had served. The air was thin and clean, carrying the promise of new beginnings and fresh challenges. Behind her, The airport buzzed with the constant activity of people coming and going, each person on their own journey, all of them connected by the invisible threads of trust and competence that made modern life possible. Ahead of her lay Denver, the airline training facility where she would learn to fly commercial aircraft, and a future that would be different from her military past, but built on the same foundation of service, professionalism, and commitment to excellence that had defined her career as a fighter pilot. The transition wouldn't be easy, but it would be worthwhile, another form of service to the country and people she had spent 20 years protecting from 30,000 feet above. In her bag, the folded uniform remained as a reminder of where she had been and what she had accomplished. But her real legacy wasn't in the cloth and ribbons. It was in the values and experiences that had shaped her character and prepared her for whatever challenges lay ahead. Captain Ghost Vasquez was ready for her next mission, carrying forward the best of her military experience while embracing the opportunities and responsibilities that awaited her in civilian life. The story that had begun at a Las Vegas security checkpoint, with the simple act of emptying a bag, had revealed itself to be about much more than military service or airport security. It was about the connections that bind Americans together across the civil-military divide, about the respect that flows between those who serve and those who benefit from that service, and about the ways that individual encounters can create moments of recognition and gratitude that strengthen the bonds of citizenship and shared commitment to values larger than individual interest. Most importantly, it was about the understanding that true service takes many forms and never really ends. It simply evolves and adapts to new circumstances, while maintaining the core commitment to making the world a better place through competence, integrity, and dedication to something larger than self. Whether in military cockpits or civilian airlines, in combat zones or commercial terminals, the fundamental challenge remained the same: to accept responsibility for outcomes that affected others, to maintain standards of excellence that enabled trust and confidence, and to honor the privilege of service through daily commitment to professionalism and competence. As Marlena Ghost Vasquez began her new life in Denver, she carried with her the knowledge that her military service had prepared her not just for civilian employment, but for civilian citizenship. The ongoing responsibility to contribute to the community, to support fellow veterans making their own transitions, and to serve as a bridge between military and civilian communities that too often operated in isolation from each other. The folded uniform in her bag would remain a symbol of her military service, but her real legacy would be written in the years ahead through her continued commitment to the values and standards that had made her an exceptional fighter pilot and would make her an exceptional commercial pilot, mentor, and citizen. The encounter at the security checkpoint had been just the beginning of a larger story that would continue to unfold as she found new ways to serve her country and fellow citizens in the next chapter of her life. 3 months later, Marlena stood in the simulator building at United Airlines' Denver training facility, watching a group of new hire pilots struggle through their first attempts at flying a Boeing 737. The simulator moved and pitched like a living thing, responding to every input with mechanical precision that couldn't quite capture the organic feel of real flight. Through the instructor's headset, she could hear the nervous breathing of Captain James Morrison, a former Navy pilot who was discovering that transitioning from military to civilian aviation required more than just technical knowledge. "Ghost, you seeing this?" asked Captain Rebecca Torres, the chief instructor who had become Marlena's mentor during her own transition 6 months earlier. Torres was a 25-year airline veteran who had started flying when women were still fighting for acceptance in commercial cockpits, and she understood the unique challenges that military pilots faced when adapting to civilian procedures and mindset. Marlena nodded, watching Morrison's hands tense on the controls as he fought the aircraft through a simulated engine failure. Military pilots were trained to push aircraft to their limits, to extract maximum performance from machines designed for combat. Civilian flying required a different philosophy: smooth, predictable, focused on passenger comfort and system longevity rather than tactical advantage. "He's flying it like an F-18, Marlena observed quietly. All muscle, no finesse. She recognized the symptoms because she had experienced them herself during her initial training. 20 years of fighter pilot reflexes didn't disappear overnight, and learning to fly with the gentle precision required for commercial operations had been one of her biggest challenges. Torres smiled grimly. "Your turn to fix him. You've got the magic touch with military transitions." It was true. Marlena had developed a reputation for helping former military pilots adapt to civilian flying, understanding both the technical differences and the psychological adjustment required to succeed in a completely different flying culture. She slipped on the instructor headset and keyed the microphone. "Morrison, this is Ghost. Take a breath and let's talk about energy management in civilian terms." Her voice carried the calm authority that had guided younger pilots through their first combat missions, but now it was applied to teaching passenger safety and operational efficiency rather than tactical survival. "Ghost," Morrison's voice cracked slightly through the intercom. "As in the ghost from Nellie's, the one who flew the Kandahar midnight run." There was recognition in his tone, the kind that passed between military pilots who had heard stories in ready rooms and officers' clubs around the world. "That's ancient history," Marlena replied evenly. "Right now I'm just another instructor trying to keep you from scaring passengers. Let's work on your approach technique." But she felt a familiar warmth at the recognition, the connection that linked military pilots across services and generations through shared experiences that civilians could never fully understand. The Kandahar midnight run had been her most famous mission, though she had never sought the attention it brought. Intelligence had identified a high-value target moving through a narrow mountain pass, but the window for engagement was tiny, and the weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Most pilots would have aborted the mission or waited for better conditions. Ghost had found a gap in the clouds and a corridor through the mountains that existed for exactly 7 minutes, long enough to acquire the target and deliver precision ordnance that disrupted an entire terror network. The mission had earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross and a reputation for finding solutions when others saw only problems. But more importantly, it had demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking and risk assessment that made military pilots valuable in civilian aviation. The ability to analyze complex situations quickly and make sound decisions under pressure. Over the next 2 hours, Marlena worked with Morrison through a series of scenarios designed to break down his military flying habits and replace them with civilian procedures. Engine failures became opportunities to demonstrate smooth crew resource management rather than solo heroics. Weather diversions became exercises in passenger communication rather than tactical navigation. Emergency procedures became methodical checklists rather than improvised responses. "Feel the difference?" she asked as Morrison completed a perfect approach to Denver International Airport, the simulated 737 settling onto the runway with the kind of smoothness that made passengers barely notice the transition from sky to ground. "In the military, we flew aircraft to accomplish missions. In civilian aviation, we fly aircraft to transport people safely and comfortably. The technical skills transfer, but the mindset has to change completely." Morrison pulled off his headset and turned to face her, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air-conditioned simulator. "It's harder than I expected," he admitted. "I keep wanting to push the aircraft harder, take more aggressive approaches, cut corners to save time. But this isn't about speed or tactical advantage." "No," Marlena agreed. "It's about reliability, predictability, and passenger trust. Every person who steps onto your aircraft is making a leap of faith that you'll get them to their destination safely and on time. They don't care about your military experience or your combat record. They care about whether you can perform routine operations with the kind of precision that makes flying feel boring. The observation struck at the heart of the military-to-civilian transition challenge. Military pilots were selected and trained for their ability to perform under extreme conditions, to make split-second decisions when lives hung in the balance, to extract maximum performance from aircraft in combat situations. Those skills were valuable in civilian aviation, but they had to be channeled differently, toward preventing emergencies rather than responding to them, toward maintaining standards rather than pushing limits. After the training session ended, Marlena walked Morrison to the debriefing room where they reviewed his performance and discussed areas for improvement. The process was familiar from her military days, the same attention to detail, the same focus on continuous improvement, the same commitment to excellence that had defined her Air Force career. But the metrics were different. Instead of mission effectiveness and combat readiness, they discussed passenger comfort, fuel efficiency, and adherence to standard operating procedures. "Ghost," Morrison said as they finished the paperwork, "I heard about what happened at the security checkpoint in Vegas. The story's been making rounds on the military pilot forums. People are calling it a moment of recognition for all of us making the transition." Marlena felt a familiar flutter of discomfort at being the center of attention. Military culture emphasized team achievement over individual recognition, and she had never been comfortable with personal fame or celebrity. "It was just a routine security check that turned into something unexpected," she said. "The real story is what happens after, how we take military experience and apply it to civilian challenges." "But that's exactly the point," Morrison insisted. "You showed that military service deserves recognition and respect, even in civilian settings. A lot of us struggle with feeling invisible after retirement, like our experience doesn't matter anymore. What happened at that checkpoint reminded everyone, military and civilian, that service leaves a mark that doesn't disappear just because you change uniforms." The conversation stayed with Marlena as she drove home through Denver traffic that evening. Morrison's comment about feeling invisible resonated with experiences she had heard from other transitioning veterans. The military provided clear structure, defined roles, and obvious measures of success. Civilian life was more ambiguous, with fewer opportunities for the kind of immediate feedback and recognition that helped military personnel understand their value and contribution. The challenge was particularly acute for pilots, who went from flying some of the most advanced military aircraft in the world to starting over as junior airline pilots, subject to seniority systems that paid little attention to previous experience or achievement. Fighter pilots who had led combat missions found themselves taking orders from civilian pilots who had never left American airspace, learning procedures that seemed designed more for regulatory compliance than operational efficiency. Her own transition had been smoother than most, partly because of her reputation within the military pilot community, and partly because of her natural teaching ability. Airlines valued instructors who could help other military pilots make successful transitions, and Marlena had found purpose in serving as a bridge between military and civilian aviation cultures. But she understood the frustration and identity challenges that affected veterans who struggled to find equivalent meaning and recognition in civilian careers. The apartment she had rented in a quiet Denver suburb reflected her transitional status, furnished with a mixture of military memorabilia and civilian practical items, arranged with military precision, but softened by touches that reflected her growing comfort with non-military identity. The leather flight jacket hung in the closet next to civilian business suits, and her medals were displayed in a shadow box alongside civilian aviation certificates and training records. As she settled into her evening routine, Marlena reflected on the day's training session and Morrison's comments about recognition and visibility. The encounter at the Las Vegas airport had become symbolic of something larger: the need for civilian society to acknowledge and appreciate military service, and the need for veterans to find ways to maintain their sense of purpose and identity while adapting to civilian life. But recognition was only part of the solution. More important was the ongoing process of translation, helping veterans understand how their military skills applied to civilian challenges, helping civilian employers understand the value that military experience brought to their organizations, and helping both communities recognize their common commitment to excellence, service, and responsibility. The next morning brought news that would test those principles in ways Marlena couldn't have anticipated. She arrived at the training facility to find Tors waiting with a grim expression and a folder containing preliminary accident reports. United Flight 1247, en route from Phoenix to Denver, had declared an emergency during approach and diverted to Colorado Springs. The aircraft had landed safely, but the incident had raised questions about pilot decision-making under pressure and the training protocols for handling complex emergency situations. "The crew handled it perfectly," Tors said, spreading the reports across her desk. "Textbook emergency procedures, excellent crew resource management, no injuries or damage. But corporate wants a full review of our training protocols, especially for former military pilots. Some people are wondering whether military habits contributed to the situation or helped resolve it." Marlena scanned the reports quickly, her trained eye picking out the key details. Engine fire warning during approach, followed by rapid but methodical response that included shutting down the affected engine, declaring an emergency, and executing a successful single-engine approach to an alternate airport. The captain was a former Air Force pilot with 3 years of civilian experience, and his first officer was a civilian-trained aviator with 15 years of airline experience. "What's the concern?" Marlena asked. "Looks like they did everything right." "That's exactly the problem," Tors replied with a wry smile. "They did everything so right that some people are wondering whether the emergency was really necessary. The engine fire warning turned out to be a false alarm caused by a faulty sensor, and some Monday morning quarterbacks are suggesting that more experienced civilian pilots would have recognized the false indication and continued to the original destination." The criticism reflected a deeper tension between military and civilian aviation cultures that Marlena had encountered throughout her transition. Military training emphasized responding to warnings and indications with immediate, decisive action based on worst-case scenarios. Better to shut down a good engine than to continue flying with a bad one. Civilian training emphasized economic efficiency and passenger convenience, with more tolerance for troubleshooting problems in flight before taking dramatic action. "So they want us to review military transition training," Marlena concluded. "Make sure we're teaching appropriate civilian decision-making rather than just translating military procedures." "Exactly, and they want you to lead the review team since you've got credibility with both communities." Tors handed her a thick folder containing training records, policy manuals, and preliminary recommendations from the airline's safety department. "Corporate thinks your reputation and experience make you the ideal person to address any concerns about military pilots in civilian cockpits." The assignment carried both opportunity and risk. Done well, it could strengthen training protocols and improve integration between military and civilian aviation cultures. Done poorly, it could create additional barriers for transitioning veterans and reinforce stereotypes about military pilots being too aggressive or inflexible for civilian operations. Marlena accepted the assignment with the same calm professionalism that had characterized her military career, understanding that the stakes involved more than just training procedures or corporate policies. The review would affect the careers of current and future military pilots making the transition to civilian aviation, and it would influence broader perceptions about the value and appropriateness of military experience in civilian contexts. Over the following weeks, she assembled a review team that included both military and civilian aviation experts, conducted interviews with transitioning pilots and their instructors, analyzed accident and incident reports, and studied training protocols at other airlines. The work was methodical and thorough, drawing on the same analytical skills that had made her an effective fighter pilot, and applying them to understanding the complex relationships between training, culture, and operational safety. The findings were both reassuring and concerning. Military pilots generally performed well in civilian aviation, with safety records that matched or exceeded industry averages. Their training in emergency procedures and decision-making under pressure was often superior to civilian-trained pilots, and their commitment to procedural compliance was typically strong. However, some military pilots struggled with the collaborative decision-making and resource management that characterized civilian cockpit operations, and a few exhibited the kind of aggressive flying that was inappropriate for passenger operations. More significantly, the review revealed gaps in training that affected both military and civilian pilots. Emergency scenarios that were common in military operations, multiple system failures, severe weather, hostile environments, received limited attention in civilian training programs. Conversely, situations that were routine in civilian operations, passenger medical emergencies, difficult customer service scenarios, complex air traffic control environments, were unfamiliar to many military pilots. The solution, Marlena concluded, wasn't to reduce military influence in civilian aviation or to question the value of military experience. Instead, it was to improve the translation process, helping military pilots understand civilian contexts while ensuring that civilian aviation benefited from the tactical thinking and emergency response capabilities that military training provided. Her final report made recommendations that would affect training throughout the industry. Enhanced crew resource management training that specifically addressed military-civilian cultural differences. Scenario-based training that combined military-style emergency response with civilian passenger considerations. Mentorship programs that paired transitioning military pilots with experienced civilian aviators. And integration of military tactical thinking into civilian emergency response procedures. The report was well received by airline management and industry safety organizations, but Marlena understood that its real impact would be measured in the careers of individual pilots making the difficult transition from military to civilian flying. Success would be counted not in corporate policy changes or industry awards, but in the quiet satisfaction of helping fellow veterans find meaningful work that honored their service while contributing to civilian society. As she submitted the final version of the report, Marlena reflected on how far she had come since that day at the Las Vegas security checkpoint. The encounter had been a moment of recognition and respect, but it had also marked the beginning of a larger mission, using her military experience and civilian position to strengthen the bridges between military and civilian communities, helping both sides understand their common commitment to excellence and service. The folded uniform still rested in her closet, a reminder of 20 years spent in service to her country. But her current work felt equally important, ensuring that the skills and values learned through military service could be applied effectively to civilian challenges, and that the sacrifice and dedication of military personnel would be recognized and utilized in ways that benefited all Americans. The story that had begun with a simple security check had evolved into something much larger, a continuing mission to honor military service while embracing civilian opportunities, to preserve the best of military culture while adapting to civilian contexts, and to ensure that the lessons learned through service and sacrifice would continue to make positive differences in the lives of others long after the uniform was folded away. 6 months after submitting her training review report, Marlena received an unexpected phone call that would test her conclusions about military-civilian integration in ways she hadn't anticipated. The call came from the National Transportation Safety Board, requesting her assistance with investigating a commercial aviation accident that had raised questions about pilot decision-making and emergency response procedures. Flight 892, a regional jet operated by Mountain West Airlines, had encountered severe weather during approach to Salt Lake City International Airport. The crew had executed a missed approach and attempted to divert to an alternate airport, but had been forced to make an emergency landing in a remote area of Utah after experiencing multiple system failures. All passengers and crew had survived, but the investigation was focusing on whether different decisions by the flight crew might have prevented the emergency landing entirely. The request was significant because the captain of Flight 892 was Major Lisa Chen, recently retired from the Air Force, and one of the first graduates of Marlena's Enhanced Military Transition Training Program. Chen had an exemplary military record as a C-130 pilot, with multiple combat deployments and commendations for performance under pressure. But she had been flying civilian aircraft for less than 18 months, and some investigators were questioning whether her military background had influenced her decision-making in ways that were inappropriate for civilian operations. "We need someone who understands both military and civilian decision-making processes," explained Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the NTSB investigator leading the inquiry. "The preliminary data suggests that Captain Chen made choices that were tactically sound but operationally questionable. We want your assessment of whether her military training helped or hindered her response to the emergency." Marlena accepted the assignment with mixed feelings. On one hand, the investigation provided an opportunity to demonstrate the value of military training in civilian emergencies. On the other hand, if Chen had made poor decisions, it could undermine efforts to integrate military pilots into civilian aviation and validate concerns about military pilots being too aggressive or inflexible for passenger operations. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder told a complex story of decision-making under pressure that unfolded over 47 minutes of deteriorating conditions. Chen and her first officer, David Park, had faced a perfect storm of challenges: rapidly changing weather, air traffic control delays, fuel system irregularities, and communication equipment failures that limited their ability to coordinate with ground support. Chen's initial response had been textbook civilian procedure, declaring an emergency, requesting vectors to an alternate airport, and following standard checklists for the system failures they were experiencing. But as conditions continued to deteriorate and their options narrowed, her decision-making had shifted toward the kind of tactical thinking that characterized military operations. Instead of continuing to the designated alternate airport, which would have required flying through a severe thunderstorm, Chen had identified a small municipal airport in a valley that was reporting marginal but improving conditions. The approach required descending through clouds without instrument guidance, using visual references to navigate around terrain that wasn't clearly marked on civilian charts. It was the kind of flying that military pilots trained for regularly, but civilian pilots rarely encountered. Tower, Mountain West 892, requesting approach to runway 26. Chen's voice was steady on the cockpit recorder, betraying no hint of the stress she must have been experiencing. "We have multiple system failures and approximately 20 minutes of fuel remaining. We need vectors for a visual approach." "Mountain West 892, stand by," came the response from the small airport's control tower, clearly unprepared for handling an emergency landing by a commercial aircraft. "We don't have approach control capabilities. Can you navigate your own approach?" "Affirmative, tower. We're declaring emergency authority and will execute a visual approach using GPS guidance. Request emergency equipment standing by." Chen's decision to take control of the situation rather than waiting for air traffic control guidance was classic military thinking. When systems fail and support isn't available, individual initiative and tactical improvisation become necessary for mission success. The approach itself was a masterpiece of flying skill and decision-making under pressure. Working with incomplete weather information and limited navigational aids, Chen had threaded the aircraft between mountain peaks and around weather systems, maintaining just enough airspeed and altitude to complete a safe landing with fuel reserves measured in minutes rather than the typical hours required by civilian regulations. All 43 passengers and 4 crew members had walked away from the aircraft without serious injury. The emergency response had been conducted by local fire and police departments who had never handled a commercial aviation accident, but Chen's radio communications had prepared them effectively for what to expect. Media coverage had praised the crew's professionalism and skill, comparing the incident to the famous Miracle on the Hudson landing that had made Captain Chesley Sullenberger a national hero. But the NTSB investigation was focused on whether Chen's decisions had been necessary or appropriate for civilian operations. Some investigators argued that a more experienced civilian pilot would have recognized that the system failures were not immediately life-threatening and would have continued to the designated alternate airport despite the weather challenges. Others suggested that Chen's military background had made her too willing to accept risks that civilian operations were designed to avoid. Marlena spent 3 weeks reviewing the evidence, interviewing the crew and passengers, and analyzing the weather and aircraft data. Her conclusion was that Chen had made exactly the right decisions at exactly the right times, demonstrating the kind of tactical thinking and risk assessment that represented the best of military training applied to civilian challenges. Captain Chen faced a situation that wasn't covered by standard civilian procedures, Marlena explained to the NTSB review panel. Multiple system failures combined with severe weather and limited fuel created a scenario where textbook responses weren't adequate. Her military training gave her the tools to assess risks dynamically and develop creative solutions when standard options weren't available. The presentation included detailed analysis of Chen's decision-making process, comparing her choices to similar situations handled by both military and civilian pilots. In every case, Chen's responses had been consistent with best practices for emergency management, even when they diverged from standard civilian procedures that were designed for more routine situations. The key point, Marlena continued, is that Captain Chen didn't abandon civilian procedures. She adapted them to circumstances that required tactical thinking. When standard approaches to the alternate airport became unsafe due to weather, she identified a creative alternative that maintained safety while accomplishing the mission of getting passengers to the ground safely. The investigation ultimately vindicated Chen's decision-making and led to changes in training protocols that better prepared civilian pilots for complex emergency scenarios. But for Marlena, the most significant outcome was the recognition that military training brought value to civilian aviation not by replacing civilian procedures, but by providing additional tools for situations where standard procedures weren't adequate. The Chen investigation became a case study in successful military-civilian integration, demonstrating how military tactical thinking could enhance civilian safety rather than compromising it. Chen herself became an instructor specializing in emergency procedures, teaching both military and civilian pilots how to adapt standard procedures to non-standard situations, while maintaining the safety focus that defined civilian aviation. For Marlena, the investigation represented another step in her evolving understanding of how military service translated to civilian contexts. The skills and values weren't different. Both military and civilian aviation required technical competence, sound judgment, and commitment to safety. But the application of those skills required understanding different contexts, different constraints, and different definitions of success. As she returned to her regular duties at the training facility, Marlena carried with her a deeper appreciation for the complexity of the military-civilian transition and the importance of creating bridges that allowed veterans to contribute their unique skills and perspectives to civilian challenges. The work wasn't just about helping individual veterans find employment. It was about ensuring that the investment society had made in military training and experience continued to pay dividends long after active duty ended. The leather duffel bag with its folded uniform had become a symbol of that ongoing mission. Military service didn't end with retirement. It evolved into new forms of service that honored the past while embracing future opportunities to make positive differences in the lives of others. Whether in airline cockpits or training facilities, investigating accidents or mentoring junior pilots, the commitment to excellence and service that had defined 20 years of military flying continued to find expression in ways that strengthened both military and civilian communities. 2 years after the Chen investigation, Marlena found herself facing a personal challenge that would test her own ability to apply military training to civilian circumstances. The phone call came at 2:30 hours, jarring her from the light sleep that had characterized her rest patterns since leaving active duty. The caller was Captain Torres, speaking with the kind of controlled urgency that immediately signaled serious trouble. "Ghost, we need you at the ops center immediately. We've got a situation developing that requires your expertise." Tor's voice carried undertones that suggested the situation involved more than routine airline operations, and Marlena was fully alert before her feet touched the floor. United Flight 328, a Boeing 777 en route from Denver to London, had experienced what appeared to be a catastrophic engine failure shortly after takeoff. The aircraft was currently circling Denver International Airport, dumping fuel and preparing for an emergency landing, but initial reports suggested that the engine failure had caused damage to other aircraft systems. More critically, the captain was Major Patricia "Hawk" Rodriguez, one of Marlena's former students and a recent Air Force retiree with limited civilian flying experience. "Rodriguez is solid," Marlena told Torres as she dressed quickly, her mind already shifting into crisis management mode. "Whatever happened up there, she'll handle it correctly, but if she needs support or advice, I want to be available." The bond between military pilots extended beyond service boundaries, creating networks of mutual support that activated automatically when one of their own faced serious challenges. The drive to Denver International Airport took 23 minutes through empty streets, giving Marlena time to process the limited information available and prepare for whatever she might find at the airline's operations center. Engine failures on commercial aircraft were rare but not unprecedented, and modern twin-engine aircraft were designed to fly safely on a single engine. However, the reports of additional system damage suggested that Flight 328 was dealing with complications that went beyond standard emergency procedures. The operations center buzzed with controlled activity that reminded Marlena of military command posts during crisis situations. Multiple screens displayed aircraft position, weather information and system status data, while airline dispatchers, maintenance personnel, and company executives worked to coordinate the emergency response. In the center of the activity, Torres stood over a radio console, maintaining contact with the flight crew and providing support for their decision-making. "Ghost, thank God you're here," Torres said without looking up from the radio. "Rodriguez is doing everything right, but this isn't a standard engine failure. The fan blade separation caused significant damage to the wing structure and affected multiple hydraulic systems. She's got limited control authority, and she's going to need every bit of skill she can muster to get this aircraft on the ground safely." Marlena slipped on a headset and listened to the radio transmissions, immediately recognizing Rodriguez's voice despite the stress and static. Hawk's radio discipline was perfect, crisp, clear communications that conveyed essential information without unnecessary detail, the kind of professional competence that characterized the best military pilots. "Denver Tower, United 328 Heavy," We're ready to begin our approach. We have 3 souls on board flight deck, 12 cabin crew, and 231 passengers. We're declaring emergency authority and requesting priority handling. Rodriguez's voice carried the calm confidence that came from extensive training and natural leadership ability. But Marlena could detect subtle signs of stress that suggested the situation was more challenging than her professional composure indicated. United 328 Heavy, Denver Tower. You are cleared for approach runway 16R. Emergency equipment is standing by. Advise your intentions for evacuation procedures. The air traffic controller's response reflected the kind of professional support that made Denver one of the premier airports for handling aviation emergencies. Tower, United 328 Heavy. We anticipate a normal landing and taxi to the gate, but will be prepared for rapid evacuation if necessary. Our flight attendants are briefing passengers on emergency procedures as a precautionary measure. Rodriguez was following textbook procedures while maintaining flexibility for changing circumstances. Exactly the kind of decision-making that Marlena had tried to teach in her transition training programs. Over the radio, Marlena could hear the subtle sounds of the cockpit, the quiet hum of electronics, the occasional click of switches, and the muted conversations between Rodriguez and her first officer as they worked through emergency checklists and prepared for landing. The sounds were familiar from thousands of hours in military cockpits, but the context was entirely different. Instead of preparing for combat or tactical operations, Rodriguez was managing an emergency that involved the lives of more than 200 civilians who had entrusted their safety to her professional competence. "Hawk, this is Ghost," Marlena keyed the radio, using call signs that connected them to their shared military experience. "I'm here in the ops center if you need anything. You're doing everything exactly right. Trust your training and trust your aircraft." "Ghost," the relief in Rodriguez's voice was audible even through the radio static. "Good to have you on frequency. We're dealing with some unusual control responses, but the aircraft is flyable and we're confident about the approach. Just wanted to let you know that your training is paying off. We're flying this like a civilian emergency, not a military mission." The distinction was crucial and reflected the successful integration of military tactical thinking with civilian operational priorities. Military emergency procedures emphasized mission accomplishment even at significant risk to personnel and equipment. Civilian emergency procedures emphasized safety above all other considerations, accepting mission failure if it meant preserving human life. Rodriguez's approach to the emergency demonstrated perfect understanding of civilian priorities while applying military-developed skills in decision-making under pressure. She had followed civilian emergency checklists methodically, coordinated with ground support effectively, and maintained passenger safety as her primary objective. But she had also demonstrated the kind of tactical flexibility and situational awareness that characterized the best military pilots, adapting standard procedures to accommodate the specific challenges created by her aircraft's damage. The landing was textbook perfect despite the aircraft's compromised control systems. Rodriguez touched down smoothly on the centerline, maintained directional control during the landing roll, and brought the aircraft to a controlled stop where emergency equipment was waiting. The evacuation was orderly and professional, with all passengers and crew exiting the aircraft safely within the timeframes established by federal regulations. "Beautiful job, Hawk," Marlena transmitted as the aircraft came to a final stop. "That's exactly the kind of flying that makes military pilots valuable in civilian operations. You combine the best of both worlds, military decision-making with civilian safety priorities." "Couldn't have done it without the training, Ghost," Rodriguez replied, her voice now relaxed with the relief that followed successful completion of a challenging mission. "Your program taught me how to translate military skills into civilian contexts. When we faced this emergency, I knew exactly how to respond because you had prepared me for situations that required both tactical thinking and passenger safety considerations. The successful outcome of Flight 328's emergency became another case study in military-civilian aviation integration. But for Marlena, it represented something more personal: validation that her work was making real differences in real situations that affected real people. The training programs, policy reviews, and individual mentorship were producing tangible results in the form of safer operations and more successful military transitions. But the incident also highlighted ongoing challenges in military-civilian integration that couldn't be resolved through training programs alone. Public reaction to the emergency had been overwhelmingly positive, with media coverage praising Rodriguez's skill and professionalism. However, some industry critics had questioned whether military pilots were more likely to encounter or create emergency situations, suggesting that military training might make pilots too willing to accept risks that civilian operations were designed to avoid. The criticism reflected deeper cultural differences between military and civilian approaches to risk management that couldn't be resolved through policy changes or training modifications. Military operations accepted higher levels of risk in service of mission accomplishment, while civilian operations prioritized risk avoidance, even when it meant operational inefficiency or mission failure. Both approaches had value in their appropriate contexts, but translating between them required ongoing effort and understanding that went beyond technical training. For Marlena, the Rodriguez incident reinforced her commitment to building bridges between military and civilian aviation communities. The work wasn't finished with successful individual transitions or positive case studies. It required ongoing attention to cultural integration, policy development, and public education that helped both communities understand their common commitment to excellence while respecting their different approaches to achieving that excellence. As she drove home from the airport in the pre-dawn darkness, Marlena reflected on how much her understanding of military-civilian transition had evolved since that day at the Las Vegas security checkpoint. What had begun as a personal journey of identity and recognition had become a professional mission focused on helping military veterans and civilian organizations benefit from successful integration. The folded uniform in her closet remained a symbol of military service and sacrifice, but it had been joined by civilian awards and recognition that reflected her contributions to aviation safety and training. The two identities, military veteran and civilian professional, were no longer separate or competing parts of her life, but integrated aspects of a continuing commitment to service that found expression in new forms while maintaining its essential character. The story that had begun with the simple act of emptying a bag at airport security had evolved into something much larger and more complex. A continuing mission to ensure that military service created lasting value not just for individual veterans, but for the civilian society they had served and continued to serve in new capacities. Whether in airline cockpits or training facilities, in accident investigations or emergency responses, the commitment to excellence and service that had defined military careers continued to make positive differences long after the uniform was put away. 3 years into her civilian career, Marlena received an invitation that would bring her full circle from that day at the Las Vegas security checkpoint. The Veterans Administration had selected her to keynote their annual conference on military-civilian transition, speaking to an audience of veterans, employers, and policymakers about successful integration strategies and the ongoing challenges faced by military personnel adapting to civilian careers. The invitation was both honor and challenge. Speaking about military-civilian transition required balancing the success stories that demonstrated the value of military experience with honest acknowledgement of the difficulties that many veterans faced in finding meaningful civilian employment. It required addressing policy issues and cultural barriers while maintaining focus.